Welcome to the, are we in the winter? Is this winter? The winter semester of our Institute for Jewish Studies, and the topic is faith. Believing is seeing. When it comes to Judaism, there are so many misunderstandings and myths that have become so ingrained in the Jewish community's collective mind. And one of those myths is the de-emphasis of faith in Judaism. And the reason why that's de-emphasized, at least one reason, there's also a kernel of truth, but we'll get to that later, but there's one reason, is for many Jews who have assimilated into American culture and who have not been given a Jewish education or a very minimal Jewish education, the way they decide what is Jewish or not Jewish is by looking at the other religions and saying, well, we don't do what they do, we don't believe in what they believe in, and since they accentuate faith, we obviously don't. That's the myth. There are some people who would even argue within the Jewish community, not only that faith is not the most important thing, or is not important, it doesn't carry any weight whatsoever. It's not important. Judaism focuses only on doing good deeds. That's another extreme form of this myth. But nothing could be further from the truth. Not only does Judaism believe that faith is an integral part of Judaism, but it's its very foundation. Here's a text from the Talmud. Habakkuk, he was one of the prophets, one of the minor prophets. He's minor not because he wasn't important. He was minor because his book is a very small book. So he's called one of the minor prophets. And he says that, as the Talmud records what he said, that Habakkuk came and he took all of the 613 commandments and he concentrated them into one mitzvah, into one religious doctrine, which is faith. And as it is written in the book of Habakkuk, a righteous man lives by his faith. So in other words, faith is the very foundation. If you have to reduce all of Judaism into one mitzvah of all 613, not to the exclusion of all the others, but if you want to simplify Judaism, the way to do it is to say Judaism is about faith. And as we go deeper into Judaism, we'll discover that the other 612 commandments revolve around faith. The question one could ask, could you imagine Judaism without faith in God? When I say faith here, I'm referring specifically to faith in God. There are many other things that we're supposed to believe in, but we're focusing now just on faith in God. Could you imagine a Judaism, let's say, without keeping kosher? Well, we're so used to that being part of Judaism that it's hard to imagine, but theologically speaking, rationally speaking, we only keep kosher because the Torah commands us to do so. But we could imagine living in a Jewish world in which that commandment didn't exist. But you cannot possibly fathom, you can't even imagine a Judaism without God. It just doesn't make any sense. What is the relationship of faith to the rest of Judaism? So it's an obvious idea that it's its very foundation. And I like to use the analogy of building a building. You hire someone to build a building and they lay the foundation. And then the contractor says, okay, have a nice day. I'm not coming back. Why not? I already built you the foundation. So what does that tell you? That tells you that, yes, there is a foundation, and if he didn't build a foundation, I know a good lawyer to sue him, because that building is not going to withstand a wind, let alone an earthquake, let alone all sorts of other disturbances. You can't have a building without a foundation. You can't have Judaism without faith. Now, what do I say to a person who says, I don't have faith, I don't believe in God, but I am a Jew, and since Jews do certain things, they keep kosher, they observe the Sabbath, and so on and so forth, I will do those things because I want to feel part of the Jewish people. Does that have any value?
No.
So you say no. You say yes. You know, I always like to say that everyone is right. From one perspective, you're right. From another perspective, you're right. But we'll get into that a little bit later. What value does doing a mitzvah if you don't believe in the very foundation of the mitzvah? You don't believe that God exists and commanded us to do it. What is lacking in faith that has caused people to think that faith is not important? Two things. Number one, as I just said, if you build a foundation and that's all you build, then you have nothing. You can't do anything with a foundation. I don't know anyone who just builds foundations and leaves it at that, because there's no point. There's no point to Judaism if Judaism was only faith, and that's all it was. So that's one thing about faith, that faith is not enough. You need a structure. But the second thing about faith is that faith has its weaknesses. What does that mean? I could believe in something that which I believe is 100% true, I'm convinced of it, no doubts about it, and yet not act in consonance with that belief. For example, I remember years ago, decades ago, there were doctors and nurses at Roswell Park who would take advantage of their break to go out and smoke, even while they're reading the sign that says that smoking could lead to the very illness that Roswell Park was established to prevent and to cure. So you could know everything about the harmful effects of smoking, the deadly effects of it. You know it better than anyone else because you're the doctor, you're the nurse, but still you don't necessarily will act in consonance with that belief, with that faith. Some people will call that cognitive dissonance. But whatever fancy term you use for it, that's reality. Translating this in faith in God, you can be someone who has profound faith in God and faith in everything that God wants us to do, and act in total disregard for that faith. And the Talmud actually illustrates this point. The Talmud uses an example that a thief is about to tunnel into, that was the old-fashioned way of breaking into a home. You dug a tunnel, and then you came up into the house to rob it. So the thief is about to tunnel into someone's home with the express intention of robbing the person, but he knows he might get caught. He might even get killed. So he stops, he pauses, and he prays to God, God, please help me, that I don't get caught and I don't get harmed, and I should be successful. And if you think that this is just some contrived, radical situation, which doesn't happen, my son Levi is a chaplain in a prison, and one of his Jewish prisoners told him that he was trying to pick a lock on someone's home, and it wasn't going. So he prayed to God, God, please help me. As soon as he finishes his prayer, the lock opens. I guess he wasn't that successful. He ended up in jail. But here, now you could say, well, he's lying. No, why would he be lying? Who is he trying to impress by praying? He's hoping there's no audience there. He's doing this between him and God. He's praying, to God, asking God to help him. If he didn't believe in God, he wouldn't be praying to him. And you know what? If he didn't believe in God, he might not have been a thief, because he'd be afraid of being caught. But now that he prayed to God, God is on his side. So it could be you can have faith, and you don't act consistently with that faith. And sometimes you could not only not act consistently, it's because of the faith that you have in God that you're willing to do things that are against God's will. Why is that? Because faith, the way it's described in Hasidic philosophy, is a peripheral force. That faith doesn't necessarily affect your faculties of your intellect, of your emotions. So you can believe in something very strongly and sincerely. We're not calling this person a faker. This person is sincere. But yet you could behave in a totally opposite way that is inconsistent with that faith. What faith requires is harnessing it to the rest of your being. And that's a major challenge, and that's the challenge that we have throughout our lives. So now the question is it all right, or to put it the way we do over here, is it kosher to doubt? God is an abstraction. God is something we can't see. And a lot of things happen in our lives that make us very upset about God's role in our lives. Why is there such suffering and pain? And people have doubts. Is it kosher to doubt? So the answer to that is in a little story over here. A chassid once complained to the third Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel. Our Rebbe is named after his great-great-great-grandfather. And he said, I have doubts. My faith is not perfect. And the Rebbe just responded nonchalantly, so what? Why do you care? Big deal. And the chassid says, Rebbe, what do you mean big deal? I'm a Jew, how could I have doubts? And the Rebbe said, if that's the way you feel, then everything is fine. If it bothers you that you have doubts, it means you really don't have doubts. You're having a problem in articulating your faith and expressing it, but you don't have doubt. You don't have any problems. I was once teaching a class, this happened actually more than once, about one of the 13 principles of faith, the last of them, which is the resurrection of the dead, that in the Messianic era, the dead will come back to life. And I mentioned the statement in the Talmud that a person who doesn't believe in that will not arise with the dead. And most of the people in the class gasped. I said, what are you worried about? I said, if you don't believe in it, you're not going to arise. So if you didn't believe in it, why are you upset? Nothing will happen. It's obvious that your gasping demonstrated that you do believe in it. So, yes.
It says it's a kosher to doubt. Yeah, I think we all doubt. However, the Alter Rebbe, who is your ultimate in Chabad, also said that as a Jew, you're obligated to know. Not faith. You're obligated to know.
Okay, we'll get to that soon. We'll get to that. Now, there's an interesting statement in the Talmud. A woman who was the wife of a great sage, her name was Yalta. She came to the house of study, and she said to the rabbis there, is there anything that I could eat that tastes like a cheeseburger? She didn't use cheeseburger. And they told her what cut of meat, the udder of the cow, since it produces milk and it has its meat, that's the closest you can get. Is there any food that I can eat that has the same taste as pork and has the same sound as mine? And they told her, yes, there's a certain fish called shibuta that has the taste of pork. The Talmud asks your question that you're thinking, how do the rabbis know the taste of pork? The Talmud asked that question. And the Talmud answers, the God reveals secrets to those who fear him. It was revealed to them. Why was she asking this question? She was a very learned woman. Why was she asking? Was she such a glutton she had to taste a cheeseburger and pork? So the commentaries explain that she was trying to show the rabbis and to reveal this idea that everything that the Torah says we cannot do, there is a kosher form of the same thing. There's a parallel. In this world, everything runs parallel. Good and evil run parallel. For every virtue there's a vice that's similar to it, but it's a vice. So she wanted to know and prove this point that every non-kosher food has its parallel kosher. Why does she want to demonstrate that? It's a separate issue we won't go into right now. So someone once asked, what's the kosher version of atheism? How could there be a kosher form of atheism? Someone will say, I don't believe in God, that it would be acceptable. And the answer was given when someone comes to you and says, could you please help so-and-so? They're destitute, they're ill, they need a lot of help. And you say, God will help. Because you have a very deep belief that God will help. And if the same thing happened to yourself, you would put your trust in God. That's kosher atheism. Leave God out of it. When someone comes to you and asks you to help someone, you're aware of someone in need of help, don't throw it on God. God is putting it in your court. You are the one who has to help, not God. There was once a chassid who was a very wealthy businessman, and he lost his business. He went bankrupt, and he came to his Rabbi, and he started crying to him, please, can you help me? My life is destroyed and devastated. And the Rabbi blessed him, and so on and so forth. A few years later, a colleague of this man, who was also very wealthy and went bankrupt, so his friend came to the same Rebbe, and he said to him, my colleague is now in bad shape because he lost his business and this and that. But you know what? Everything God does is for a reason. We can't question God. And the Rebbe says, I don't understand. When you had that problem, you didn't throw it on God. You didn't justify it by saying God knows what he's doing. It's only when someone else is in trouble, then you find solace in the fact that God is in control of everything. When it comes to helping someone, you don't bring God into the picture. Of course, if you want to console the person and find a way of making the person feel better, that's one thing. But if you're saying God will help and you don't have to help, that's where we can leave God out of it. And here's the question that so many people ask. How could you say that faith in God is so important in terms of being a moral person when we know so many people who believe in God, who are very pious and are terrible people, and conversely, there are atheists who are wonderful, wonderful, good, kind-hearted people who go out of their way to help others. So could you really be a good person without faith? It seems that you could. So what do you think?
You just don't realize it when you go to help people.
Okay. So there was 2 points to the answer. Number one, where did the atheist get the idea of helping other people? If you take atheism seriously, what is an atheist really saying? That there is no God, and therefore there is no purpose in the creation of the universe. If the universe was ever created, it just came about, Big Bang and so on. Therefore, there is nothing meaningful and purposeful in existence. Whatever you do is not any better than whatever else others do, or it's no worse than what others do. So atheism does not allow you to accept the idea that there's right and wrong. How could you say something is wrong? Why is it wrong to murder someone? There's no purpose in creation. There's no God. There's no morals. Morality is what society decides it wants it to be, and then it could change. And you see it changing in front of our very eyes. Society is changing its values, radically changing them. So why would an atheist be a good person? The answer is they got it from their grandmother, or their great-grandfather, or their uncle, or their aunt, or maybe their parents, who were committed to doing good and being kind. So they picked that up. That's number one. And number two, which is a deeper reason, which is consistent with what you just said, that everybody has faith deep down in their psyche, in their soul, which we'll go into in a few minutes. So the atheist has it as well. So they will behave in ways that are irrational for an atheist. For a believer, it's rational to do good. For an atheist, it's irrational. Who is more rational, an atheist or a believer? The only time an atheist is rational, at least behaves rationally, is when they're evil. Then it's consistent with anything you want to do for your own benefit is fine. Yes?
You know the expression in the military, when you're in battle, that there's no atheist in foxhole.
Right.
That is kind of supports the idea of the deep feeling that everybody has when you're in the middle of battle. You're praying. No matter who you are, you're praying for your life.
Right, that's true.
And you do believe that.
There are to be accurate, there are atheists who, no matter how much circumstances command your faith, they will not express that faith. There are people who could have it covered up. There was once a great Jewish poet who came to the fifth Chabad Rebbe, and they had for hours of discussion. And the Rebbe said about him, if he would be standing when the sea split, when the Jews crossed the sea and the Egyptians were drowned, he would still not believe. That's how deeply ingrained his atheism was. So it's possible, but as a general rule, you're right. There are no atheists in a foxhole. Now, many people feel that science and faith are mutually exclusive, that a scientist cannot really be a believer, which is nonsense because there are thousands of great scientists that are believers. And in fact, science and faith enhance each other. Anyone who has true faith in God is not afraid of research, of discovering things. Because the more we search, the more we find the truth of existence, that everything has a divine spark in it and a divine purpose. You know what? A few hundred years ago, scientists used to believe that the world is made up of many different elements and many different forces. And now science is coming to a point where it recognizes that everything is unified. The scientists were always looking for a unified field theory. And they're coming closer and closer to realizing the total unity of the universe. There's even recent scientific theories that time and space don't even exist. In other words, so what does exist? There must be a unified force in this world, which the scientists will not call God, but we could safely say they're referring to God. Science is coming closer and closer to the recognition of God. Yet there are differences. The Torah will say certain things that contradict what scientists say, but we have to remember, it could be three possibilities. Number one, we misunderstand what the Torah says. Number two, we misunderstand what science says. And number three, which is the most important point, science is not truth. No one ever claims science is truth. It's the pursuit of truth. Faith deals with truth, with absolute truths. So no matter what contradictions we find between science and religion, you can't really create a contradiction, because science, even if all scientists will agree, which is nonsense. Scientists don't, you never find all scientists agreeing. It's almost like Jews. You can't get everyone to agree. But even if they would all agree on something, all they're saying is, based on present knowledge of the universe, this is what we feel is the theory behind whatever thing that goes on in the universe. They can't say that this is absolute and it will never change. For hundreds of years, Newton was considered to be the supreme voice in physics, and Einstein came and reversed this and overrode that. And to this day, I think Einstein is still considered to be valid, but who knows? It could always change. So there can't really be a contradiction between science and religion, because science doesn't claim to be truth, it's pursuit of truth, and God, belief in God, is absolute. Although this requires another lecture, I'll just mention it briefly. We often talk about faith in God and trust in God. On our currency, it says, "In God we trust." What's the difference between faith and trust? Trust, of course, requires faith. If I say I trust God, it means I have faith and I believe in God. But belief doesn't necessarily mean trust. I believe that so-and-so is an honest person. But if he wants to borrow $10,000 from me, I might say, you know what? You're a nice guy. I really have faith in you. But I'm not ready to give you $10,000. Knowing your economic situation, I'm not sure you'll be able to repay it. So you can have faith in someone, but not necessarily trust. What does that mean in terms of God? Faith in God is more than just believing that he exists. Faith in God means that I believe that God will come through. That if I pray to God that so-and-so should recover from an illness, it will happen. That's what faith means. But we know that there are times when people pray and it doesn't happen. I got it the other way around. Trust means that I know that whatever God says he'll do, he will do. I trust him. But sometimes it happens that God doesn't come through. So I still have faith that whatever God does is for the best. I just don't understand his way of doing things. So trust means that I know that things will work out the way they're supposed to work out, based on my prayers, based on God's promises. But if they don't, I have faith that whatever God does is for the best. A famous story in the Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. He came to a town. He needed a place to sleep, and no one would let him in. They were horrible people, inhospitable. And whenever he was thrown out of a house, he said, this is all for the best. Whatever God does is for the best. And then he went to sleep in the forest. He had a candle, he lit it, and he had a donkey, and he had a rooster, and a wolf came and devoured the rooster. A mountain lion or a lion came and killed the donkey, and the wind extinguished the fire, the flame. And he said, whatever God does is for the best. The next morning he came back to the town. The whole town was ransacked, and everyone was taken prisoner. And he knew that if the candle was still burning, or if his donkey or if his rooster were still alive, it would have exposed his place where he was sleeping, and he would have been taken prisoner as well. So things didn't work out the way he wanted them to work out, but in the end, he knew whatever God does is for the best. So faith in God means I know that whatever God does is for the best. I'm not sure he'll do what I want. Trust is where you trust that God will come through for you the way you, and the degree to which you put your trust in God can determine the outcome itself. But that's a separate subject we'll talk about some other time. Okay, so we know that faith is an important part of Judaism. It's the very foundation. Is it a commandment to have faith? Maimonides lists it as the first commandment, based on the first of the 10 commandments. The first commandment is, I am God, your God, who was taking you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. So Maimonides says that is a command. It's a statement. God says, I am God, your God, but there's a mitzvah, a commandment to believe in God. At least that's how it's understood at face value. And that poses a very serious problem. The Abarbanel, one of the great, or not only the Abarbanel, many others, say it doesn't make any sense. How could you command someone to have faith in God? Does the person who's given the commandment have faith? The answer is no. Oh, but you're commanded to have faith. Who commanded me? God. Well, I don't believe in him. How could you command someone who doesn't believe to believe? And if he already believes in God, he doesn't need the commandment. You can't command someone who believes in God, I'm commanding you to believe in God, but I already believe. What's the commandment for? So many other authorities say that obviously belief in God is not a commandment. Either you believe or you don't believe. So one of the explanations is that you don't really need a commandment to believe in God, because belief in God is just obvious. If you're a rational person, you will have to come to the conclusion that the world came into existence by virtue of a creator. It's irrational to believe that the world exists on its own. You would never use that approach to anything else in life. This Talmud tells the story of Rabbi Yehoshua. He was a great sage, and he would always debate Greek philosophers, Roman philosophers. And once he was having a debate with the emperor in Rome. And the emperor was saying to the rabbi, prove to me that there is a creator. And the rabbi didn't get anywhere. And then the king had to excuse himself. And the rabbi there was an inkwell on the table. He took the ink and he drew a beautiful picture. He was an artist. And when the king came back, he said, who drew this? He says, oh, I'm sorry, I knocked over the inkwell and out came this picture. He says, that's ridiculous. Nothing can happen by itself. So that was the proof. But it's a very simple proof, but it's not simplistic. It's obvious. It's only people who, for some reason, can't accept the idea of a God because it goes against their own interest, which explains why is there atheism in this world? Why do people want to deny? And the answer is they want to be free to do whatever they want. Because if you believe in a God, you can't just believe that there's a God. You have to believe that God created the world, and he created a purposeful world. And the purpose of the world is for people to live in a certain way, in a certain moral and ethical way. And if you don't want to live that way, you have to deny that there's a God and rationalize. It's a rationalization. It makes your life easier. It takes away the guilt. You know, they often say that people who believe in God, that they use it as a crutch. No, it's the other way around. The atheist, his lack of belief is a crutch, because he or she, whenever I talk about bad people, I usually say he. Once in a while I'll throw in she. But the men are the ones who cause most of the problems. But if you want to live a free life, free meaning free of all restraints, of all morals, and you're going to feel very guilty if you believe in a God. So you actually have to convince yourself that you don't believe in a God, and that way you can do whatever you want. I was once discussing this with a scientist and about the existence of God, and he says, all my colleagues believe in God because they work with DNA, and there's no way, it's so complex that it came about by itself. We don't believe, however, that God commanded us to do all the things. So they were able to have their cake and eat it as well. They can have faith in God and still do whatever they want because they didn't believe that God ever gave us any laws, any commandments. So you see how the mind works. The mind will always work to try to rationalize your behavior so that you are not guilt-ridden. And the crutch is not to believe in a God. You know, it's true that sometimes people who believe in God, for them it's a crutch as well. So my response to that is, if you have a hard time walking, use the crutch. There's nothing wrong with using God as a crutch. But the atheist should not say that he's not using a crutch, because being an atheist is really based on self-preservation and self-justification. So let's go back to Maimonides. So why is there a commandment to believe in God? And the answer is no, that's not the commandment. Belief in God is obvious. It's the most rational thing. Belief in God, the commandment is to know God, and that's what you were referring to before. It's to reflect on God, to meditate on God, to try to understand, to the extent that a human being could understand, God's existence and his relationship with us. That's what the mitzvah is, to take the belief that we already have and deepen it. Because when you deepen it, it solves the other problem that we said before, that you can have faith and you could become a crook. But if you deepen the faith, that the faith is part of your consciousness, it's part of your way of thinking, it'll affect your whole personality, and that way you will not do things contrary to that faith. So the mitzvah is not to believe in God. And if you look in Maimonides, you see that one of the problems is Maimonides wrote many books. Most of his books he wrote in Arabic. The one book that he wrote in pure Hebrew was his major work, the Mishnah Torah. That's his encyclopedic work of Jewish law. So when you read his other books, you're reading translations from Arabic, and the translations are not necessarily accurate or precise. In his book of Commandments, the translation is, there's a mitzvah to believe in God. But in his original Hebrew book, he uses a word, mitzvah leida, to know. The same root as the word das, to know God. So the Rebbe points out that the mitzvah is really to know God, not just to believe in God. But then there's another reconciliation. Yes, the mitzvah is also to believe in God, but not believe that God exists. That's common sense. That's obvious. That's a given. Not only to know God with your intellect as much as possible, but to believe that whatever you know about God, God is beyond that. So when you're a little child, a 3-year-old, 5-year-old child, you describe God. To the child has an infantile understanding of God. To the child, it's a big giant somewhere above the clouds who has power to bless us or to hurt us. It's a very infantile image of God. So what do you tell the child? God is more than that. He's beyond that. But when you become an adult and you become more sophisticated and you become this great philosopher, this great theologian, and you have a much more sophisticated, abstract vision of God, you then say, but God is beyond that. God is not limited by that. Sometimes we limit God by saying how great he is. He's infinite. And the Kabbalists say, yes, God is infinite, but he's not limited to being infinite. God has the power to be involved in a finite mode of existence. That's just one example of that. God is beyond intellect. If you ask the average person, especially if you ask a scientist, what's the highest force in the universe that a human being has? They'll say his mind. What's more than your mind?
So,
The answer is God. The soul, which is a part of God, is beyond your mind. God is beyond anything that's connected to logic. Just like you take a glass. What could you put in this glass, in this cup?
wine.
You could put wine, hopefully good wine, vodka, coffee. You could put anything. That's not really true. Could you put love? in this cup? Could you put fear in this cup? Could you put logic in this cup? No, you can't. You can only put physical things in this cup. Logic doesn't fit into this cup. Well, just like logic doesn't fit into a cup, neither does God fit into logic. That God is bound by logic. Yes, God created logic, and he uses logic. It's one of his tools, but he is not bound by it. So if someone says, why did God do this? It doesn't make any sense. It says, you know what? When something makes sense that God does, that's what I marvel at. That God can sometimes make sense. That means God created a miracle that he allowed himself to be accessed through logic. But God himself is beyond logic. So that's the mitzvah, the commandment, not just to believe that there is a God, but it's to know God and then to realize that God is beyond anything you know. That's the ultimate commandment, to know God.
He's also within it, though.
He's in.
He's beyond logic, but he's within logic at the same time.
He's in everything because he put himself into it. But he's beyond it. He's not bound by it. You can't challenge. You could challenge a scientist if he says something that's unscientific, it's irrational. Because if it's what he says is not rational, it's not logical, it destroys his whole thesis. But God cannot be destroyed because he doesn't make sense. The miracle is that he does make sense. That's the miracle. So if occasionally he doesn't make sense, that's, what do I expect? Someone once said, I forgot who it was, I would never worship a God that I could understand. Okay, we'll have to continue this next week, God willing. Any questions? We're going to talk about next week, where does faith come from? Where do I get faith from? Is it because my parents taught me about God? Obviously, that's true for most people. But faith, we're going to learn, comes from an inner well. And there are different ways of explaining that. Okay, we'll take a little break.
You opened the door to a question I have, and I came in here today. I'm reading English. I don't read any Hebrew. I'm not good at Hebrew. So talk about